This was the blood moon that terrified people in the Jesus era, without science or explanation. The night sky was not a wonder. It was a warning. For most people living in first-century Judea, the sky above was not something to be admired from a safe distance with a glass of wine and a sense of philosophical curiosity. It was a ceiling that moved, a living surface that communicated, that pressed down on the world below with intention and consequence. Every shift in its patterns carried weight. Every irregularity had a name, a meaning, and an effect on the decisions of real people in real villages doing real work. So, when the moon, the great silver lamp that governed the night, that guided travelers through mountain passes, that told shepherds when to move their flocks, that organized the entire rhythm of the Jewish religious calendar, when that moon began to change color, began to deepen from white to orange to a dark, heavy, bleeding red, what people felt was not awe. What they felt was dread. And if you think you already understand why, stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels entirely. It changes what certain crowds were thinking when they gathered. It changes what certain silences meant. It changes why the language of cosmic signs runs so deeply through the words of Jesus, through the prophecies he quoted, through the terror and expectation that surrounded every moment of his ministry. Because the blood moon in the ancient world was not a natural phenomenon that happened to be dramatic, it was, to the people who saw it without telescopes, without atmospheric science, without any framework to neutralize its appearance. It was a rupture, a crack in the order of things, and what it meant depended on who you were, where you were standing, and what you had already been told to expect. To understand the blood moon in the time of Jesus, you have to leave behind every modern instinct you have about the night sky and walk into a village in first-century Galilee sometime between sunset and the second watch of the night. Not as a tourist, as someone who lives there, someone who has never seen an electric light, someone whose entire orientation to reality, time, direction, harvest, prayer, danger, safety, is organized by the position and appearance of celestial bodies. The village is quiet, but not silent. There is the sound of dogs somewhere near the edge of the settlement. There is the smell of cook fires dying down, of dried animal dung that was used as fuel, of olive oil burning low in small clay lamps inside homes where the walls are close and the ceilings are low. The air at night, even in the warmer months, carries a chill in the hill country of Galilee. People wrap themselves in their outer garments, the same garments they wore during the day, which doubled as their blankets at night, which is why Mosaic law prohibited those garments from being kept as permanent collateral for a debt. To take a man's cloak overnight was to take his warmth. Outside, if you look up on a clear night, the moon dominates everything. There are no competing light sources. The moon on a full night in that world cast shadows. Real shadows. You could walk a road by moonlight and see the stones beneath your feet. Shepherds relied on it. Travelers calculated by it. The Jewish religious calendar, Passover, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, was built on the lunar cycle with a precision that required trained observers to watch the first appearance of each new crescent and report it to the authorities in Jerusalem, who would then signal across the countryside with fire beacons set on hilltops. The moon was not background. The moon was infrastructure. And the full moon, which in Hebrew is called Meliah, the full one, carried its own specific religious significance. Passover falls on the 14th of Nisan, which is always a full moon night. The Feast of Tabernacles begins on the 15th of Tishrei, also a full moon. The great feasts of Israel were timed by design to occur when the night sky was brightest. when pilgrims walking roads toward Jerusalem would have maximum visibility, when the symbolism of fullness and light could be felt in the body, not just recited in a text. If you want to know what this content means for your faith, keep watching. And if these reconstructions of the biblical world speak to something in you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Now, imagine that full moon on a feast night, on a night when thousands of pilgrims are camped outside Jerusalem, on a night when the air is thick with the smell of sacrificial fires and the sound of psalms being sung by families huddled together. Imagine that moon beginning to darken, beginning to redden, beginning to look, to every unprotected eye watching from the ground, like something is happening to it, like it is being consumed, like it is bleeding. There was no announcement beforehand, no chart, no algorithm sending a notification to your wrist. There was only the sky changing, and there was only what you already knew, what your father told you, what the scrolls in the synagogue said, what the traveling teachers had been warning about for generations, that signs in the heavens would precede catastrophe, that the sun would be darkened and the moon would turn to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord. You are standing in a field outside Jerusalem. You have walked 3 days to be here. You have brought your family. The moon has just turned red. What do you do? What you do, in that moment, is look around. You look at the faces of the people nearest to you. You look at the older men, the ones who have seen more seasons, who carry the weight of memory and interpretation. You look at the priests moving near the temple courts. You look at the sky again, and then back at the faces, because in a world without institutional science, without a meteorological authority, without any external framework to tell you what something means, the meaning of an event is determined collectively. It is negotiated in real time by the community that witnesses it. And if the older men look afraid, then the event is frightening. If the priests continue their work without pausing, then perhaps it is contained. But if everyone stops, if the singing slows, if the children are pulled closer, if the murmuring spreads through the camp like a wind moving through dry grass, then something has shifted that cannot be unshifted that night. This is the social architecture of fear in the ancient world. It was not private. It was not processed alone in a room with a book and a breathing exercise. It was immediate, communal, and contagious. And it operated on a fuel source that the modern world has largely lost access to: the unbroken memory of precedent catastrophe. The people gathered outside Jerusalem during the major feasts in the time of Jesus were not a generic religious crowd. They were a specific people with a specific history, and that history was not abstract to them. It was alive. It was recited. It was embedded in the liturgy of every major feast they were celebrating. The Passover Haggadah, the order of telling that structured the Passover meal, explicitly commanded every participant to see themselves not as descendants of people who had been slaves in Egypt, but as people who had themselves been slaves, who had themselves been brought out. The distance between past and present in Jewish liturgical memory was intentionally collapsed. History was not something that had happened. It was something that was perpetually happening, perpetually being relived, perpetually being interpreted for its implications in the present moment. This is why the prophetic literature carried the weight it did. When the prophet Joel wrote that the sun would be darkened and the moon would turn to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord, he was not composing poetry for a literary anthology. He was issuing a framework, a perceptual lens, a set of instructions for how to read the sky when something unusual happened. And that framework had been memorized, recited, sung, and handed down through generations until it was not doctrine, but instinct, until it lived not in the mind, but in the gut. When the moon turned red, Joel activated. Not as a reference, as a reflex. To understand how deep this ran, you have to understand the texture of prophetic education in first-century Judea. Literacy was not universal, but oral transmission was. The synagogue system, which by the time of Jesus was well established throughout Galilee and Judea, functioned as a weekly recitation chamber. The Torah was read aloud in its entirety over the course of a year. The prophets were read alongside it. Children memorized large portions from early ages. The traveling teachers, the rabbis who gathered disciples and moved through the villages teaching, operated through a method called Shazan and Darash, public reading and public interpretation, that kept the prophetic texts constantly in circulation as living commentary on present events. So the words of Joel, the words of Isaiah, the words of Daniel, these were not archived, they were current. They were the interpretive grammar through which ordinary people processed extraordinary experiences. And several of those texts spoke with terrible specificity about what would happen to the moon. Isaiah 13 describes the day of the Lord as a time when the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light, when the rising sun will be darkened and the moon will not shine. Isaiah 24 describes the moon being embarrassed and the sun ashamed. Ezekiel 32 uses the darkening of celestial lights as a metaphor for the collapse of political power, specifically the fall of Egypt. But the metaphor worked because the audience already understood celestial darkness as a sign of divine judgment. Joel 2, the most explicit, connects the darkening of sun and moon directly to the gathering of armies, the shaking of heaven and earth, and an event so large it requires cosmic punctuation. These were not obscure texts. These were the texts that people quoted to each other in the marketplace, in the synagogue, in the fields. These were the texts that the various apocalyptic movements circulating through first-century Judaism. And there were many, from the Essenes near the Dead Sea to the various messianic movements that rose and fell throughout the period. These were the texts those movements used as their primary evidence that the end of the present age was near. The air of first-century Judea was already saturated with eschatological expectation before any blood moon appeared. The Roman occupation had been grinding the population down for decades. Taxation was brutal. Land dispossession was common. The gap between the priestly aristocracy in Jerusalem and the subsistence farmers of Galilee was vast and felt daily. There were people who had lost their ancestral land to debt. There were people whose sons had been conscripted, whose daughters had been dishonored, whose fathers had been killed in uprisings that the Romans suppressed with a systematic cruelty designed to function as permanent warning. Crucifixions along the roads, villages burned, the temple functioning as a collaborationist institution between priestly power and Roman authority, while ordinary people were expected to continue bringing their tithes and their offerings and their taxes all at once. In that context, the desire for the great and terrible day of the Lord was not abstract theology. It was hunger. It was the hunger of people who had run out of earthly options and were waiting for heaven to act. And into that hunger, the blood moon fell like a stone into still water. The rings it sent out touched everything. They touched the crowds that gathered around charismatic teachers. They touched the questions those crowds asked. Questions about when, about signs, about what to watch for. They touched the edge of every conversation about the kingdom of God, because the kingdom of God was not, in that world, a spiritual metaphor. It was a political and cosmic event. It was the replacement of Roman order with divine order. It was the reversal of everything that had gone wrong. And it was expected to be preceded by signs, by darkness at noon, by the moon turning to blood. Jesus knew this landscape intimately, not as an observer, not as a teacher who had read about it from a distance and arrived to comment. He had grown up inside it. He had grown up in Nazareth, a small agricultural village in Lower Galilee, in a region where the memory of Roman violence was not ancient history, but living wound. When Jesus was a child, a man named Judas of Galilee led an uprising not far from where he lived. The Roman response was the kind that left marks on a generation: crucifixions, reprisals, villages that went quiet for years afterward. The apocalyptic expectation that filled the air of first-century Judea was not something Jesus encountered when he began his ministry. It was the water he had always breathed, and he engaged it with a precision that only makes sense when you understand the material world it was embedded in. The Olivet Discourse, the long teaching recorded in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, in which Jesus speaks at length about the destruction of the temple, the tribulation, and the signs of the end, is one of the most debated passages in all of Christian scripture. Scholars have argued about its scope, its timing, its audience, its fulfillment for centuries. But before any of that argument can be entered responsibly, there is a prior question that almost never gets asked with sufficient seriousness. What did the people sitting in front of Jesus already believe about cosmic signs before he opened his mouth? Because Jesus was not introducing a new framework. He was speaking into one that already existed, already hummed with voltage, already had years of accumulated expectation pressing against it from every direction. When he said, in the middle of that discourse, that the sun would be darkened, and the moon would not give its light, and the stars would fall from the sky, he was not constructing an image. He was activating one. He was reaching into the storehouse of prophetic memory that every person listening had been filling since childhood. And he was saying, yes, this, what you have always suspected the sky was capable of announcing. This is real. This is coming. Pay attention to what I tell you next. The crowd sitting on the Mount of Olives, looking across the Kidron Valley at the gleaming stones of the temple, were people who had watched blood moons rise over that same city. Some of them had been present during the lunar eclipses that astronomers have since calculated fell during Passover in the years surrounding Jesus' ministry. The convergence of a blood moon with Passover, the feast that already commemorated the night the angel of death passed through Egypt, the night the doorposts were marked with blood, the night that liberation and terror arrived simultaneously. That convergence was not subtle. It was overwhelming. It pressed on every nerve that prophetic education had exposed. And blood was already everywhere in the Passover ritual. To understand this, you have to walk through what Passover actually looked like in Jerusalem in the 1st century. Because the modern Seder, a home ceremony conducted around a table with symbolic foods and a book, bears only a structural resemblance to what happened in Jerusalem when the temple was standing. The 1st century Passover was a sacrifice. It was tens of thousands of lambs brought to the temple courts over the course of the afternoon before the feast, slaughtered by their owners, their blood caught by the priests in golden and silver bowls that were passed hand to hand in a long chain from the point of slaughter to the base of the altar, where the blood was dashed against the stone. The smell of that afternoon was iron and smoke. The sound was the low, continuous cry of animals and the rhythmic singing of the Hallel Psalms, Psalms 113 through 118, chanted by the Levites and echoed back by the crowds in a call and response that filled the entire Temple Mount and spilled out over the walls into the city below. This was not metaphor. This was material reality. This was the world in which Jesus sat at a table with his disciples on the night of Passover and took bread and broke it and said, "This is my body," and took a cup of wine. Wine the color of blood. Wine being poured on the night when blood had been the means of salvation for Israel in Egypt, and said, "This is my blood of the covenant." Every person at that table understood blood as a covenantal substance. They had been handling it, smelling it, singing over it, for as long as they could remember. The connection Jesus was making was not abstract. It landed in bodies that already knew what blood meant at Passover, in a city that was already dark with the smoke of sacrifice, under a sky that had, within living memory, turned that same deep red. Now consider what it meant, in that world, when a blood moon rose specifically on Passover night. The Talmud, compiled later but drawing on traditions that circulated much earlier, contains a passage that describes the meaning of various celestial signs. A lunar eclipse, according to that tradition, is a bad omen for Israel, because Israel reckons by the moon. But when the eclipse makes the moon appear red, it is specifically interpreted as a sign that the sword is coming to the world. The connection between the red moon and military catastrophe, between the bleeding sky and the spilling of human blood, was not a leap of imagination. It was a direct, categorical, widely shared interpretation that required no explanation to a first-century Jewish audience. They already knew what it meant, and they knew it in the way that only people who have already experienced catastrophe know things. They knew it the way the children of Holocaust survivors know certain silences, the way the descendants of people who survived famines know what it means when the grain stores start running low. Not as information, as somatic knowledge, as something that lives in the chest before it reaches the mind. The blood moon in the time of Jesus was terrifying, not because people were ignorant. It was terrifying because they were informed, because they had been told, in the most authoritative texts their civilization possessed, exactly what a red moon preceded. And because they had already seen enough of history to know that the texts were not exaggerating. The sword had come before. The city had burned before. The temple had fallen before. And the sky, before each of those events, had done something strange. There is a moment recorded in the book of Acts that most readers pass through quickly, treating it as a kind of ceremonial opening to the story of the early church. A speech made in the heat of a remarkable morning, full of quotations that seem chosen for rhetorical effect. But when you place it back inside the world that produced it, when you set it against the sky that those people had been watching their entire lives, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes one of the most precisely calibrated public addresses in the entire New Testament. 50 days after Passover, 50 days after the crucifixion. The city of Jerusalem is full again because Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, the feast that commemorated the giving of the Torah at Sinai, is another pilgrimage feast, another occasion that drew Jews from across the diaspora back to the city. The streets are crowded with people who speak Greek, Aramaic, Latin, the languages of Parthia and Egypt and Cappadocia. The air is warm. The temple courts are open. And then something happens in a house in the city that spills out into the street, that draws a crowd, that demands explanation. Peter stands up. And the first sustained biblical text he quotes, the text he reaches for to explain what is happening, to give the crowd a framework for processing an event that has no ordinary category, is Joel 2:2. He quotes it at length. He quotes the part about the Spirit being poured out on all flesh. He quotes the part about sons and daughters prophesying, about young men seeing visions and old men dreaming dreams. And then he quotes the part that the crowd already knew by heart, the part that every person standing in that street had felt in their chest on every night the sky had behaved strangely. He quotes the part about wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke. He quotes the part about the sun being turned to darkness, and he quotes the part about the moon being turned to blood. He quotes it in the past tense, before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. And it is this that stops everything. Because Peter is not warning them that the blood moon is coming. He is telling them that what Joel described has already begun, that the sequence has been initiated, that the signs they had been trained since childhood to watch for, the signs they had greeted with dread on every Passover night when the moon rose red over the city, those signs were not pointing toward something distant. They were pointing toward something that had already happened in that city, on that Passover, 50 days before. The blood moon, in Peter's address, is not a future terror. It is a completed signpost. This is the moment that changes everything about how the early followers of Jesus understood what they had witnessed. The crucifixion had not looked like victory. It had looked like the worst possible outcome. A teacher executed by the state, his followers scattered. The movement apparently ended before it had fully begun. The disciples who had walked away from Jerusalem on the road to Emmaus on the day of the resurrection were not walking away in triumph. They were walking away defeated, saying, "We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." Past tense. Had hoped. As in, that hope is now in the past. As in, it did not happen the way we expected. But now Peter is standing in Jerusalem and reframing the entire sequence. He is saying, go back. Go back to what you know about the signs. Go back to Joel. Go back to every blood moon you ever watched rise over this city with your stomach tight and your hands cold. Go back to what you were always told those signs preceded. And now, understand that the great and terrible day of the Lord did not look like what you expected. It looked like a man on a cross. It looked like 3 days of silence. It looked like an empty tomb at dawn. The cosmic signs you were taught to fear were not pointing toward Roman armies. They were pointing toward this. To understand the weight of what Peter is doing, you have to feel the accumulated dread that had been building in that population for generations. The blood moon had always meant something enormous is about to break open. Something that will change the shape of the world. Something that no human power can stop or redirect. And the people who heard Peter that morning had lived with that dread their entire lives. They had watched the sky. They had counted the signs. They had whispered to each other about whether this generation was the one, whether this Passover would be the one, whether the red moon rising over the Temple Mount meant that the armies were already gathering somewhere beyond the horizon. And Peter is telling them, you were right to watch. You were right to take the signs seriously. But the event you were waiting for did not announce itself with trumpets and cavalry. It announced itself with a carpenter's son from Galilee, with 3 years of teaching in the villages, with a meal in an upper room, with a garden where a man prayed until his sweat fell like drops of blood, with a Roman execution outside the city walls, with a stone rolled across a tomb, with darkness at midday, with the moon already having turned to blood on the Passover nights that had framed his entire ministry. The blood moon terrified people in the era of Jesus because it was the most visceral, most undeniable, most physically present form of the sign they had been waiting for. It could not be argued with. It could not be reinterpreted away in the moment. It hung over the city in full view of every person who stepped outside, and it said, in the only language that required no translation across dialect or education or social class, something is coming, something large enough to register in the sky, something that the order of ordinary life cannot contain. What the first followers of Jesus discovered, what Peter articulates in that street on the morning of Pentecost, what would take the rest of the New Testament to begin to work out, is that the event the blood moon was announcing had already arrived, not in the form they had imagined, not in the form of divine armies routing Roman legions, in the form of a love radical enough to enter fully into human suffering, to descend all the way to the bottom of it, and to come back changed. The sky had been telling the truth all along. The moon had turned to blood, and the blood had meant something no one had been prepared to expect. Jesus did not stand apart from the terror of those nights. He stood inside it, alongside the farmers and the shepherds and the pilgrims who looked up and felt their chests tighten. He quoted the same texts they quoted. He watched the same sky they watched. He knew what the red moon meant to the people sitting in front of him when he spoke on the Mount of Olives, and he did not dismiss their fear or correct their instinct. He honored it. He said, "Yes, watch the sky. Yes, the signs are real. Yes, something is coming that will shake everything that can be shaken." And then he showed them, with his own life, what it looked like when heaven finally acted. Not with fire from above, with a body broken open below. The blood moon was not a mistake of atmosphere. In the world that produced the Gospels, in the world that Jesus inhabited and taught and died in, it was a word written in the oldest language available to the sky. And the people who heard it, who felt it in the pit of their stomachs on Passover nights when the moon rose heavy and red over the city of Jerusalem, were not superstitious primitives stumbling in the dark. They were people waiting for God to keep a promise. And in the silence, after the red light faded, and the ordinary silver moon returned, and the night went on, as nights do. In that silence, some of them had already begun to understand that the promise had been kept in a way that no sign in the sky could have fully prepared them to receive.